So I'm gonna attempt to do a video on replacing the timing cover seals on my 2007 XC90 with the 4.4 V8. Last year I did the valve cover seals and then realized that my timing cover was also leaking. So first thing I did was got it in the garage, unhooked the battery, and took the upper torque bar off. I have the headlights out, but that's for something else that doesn't need to be done. I just took the rim off, jacked it up, put the jack stand under it, because I will need to get at the harmonic balancer under here and pull that off and do my best to show this process, just because I noticed there really was nothing out there on YouTube for videos on this job. So stick with me as we go through this and hopefully it helps you out. Thanks. Okay, so back to work on the V8. Pulled off the plastic covers on the valve covers. They just pop off front and rear. Started taking things loose. I had this apart last year, so had some different clamps on here, took that loose. Right now I'm removing the rear, I guess it would be vibration dampener mounting. Those are 13 millimeter bolts, 4 of them, taking those loose. This little front cover here that goes over the power steering pump, that just has 2 little bolts that hold that on, took that loose. I will be removing the upper part of the intake. All these bolts come out. I will show once I get further into that just how to do that. I'll be taking the power steering reservoir out and the coolant reservoir out so I have more room, and I'll just kind of be breaking down some of this as we go. Under here I've got the rim off, obviously, the harmonic balancer. You're supposed to have a special tool to kind of lock that in place. I don't have an impact to work, and so I need to figure out yet how I'm gonna get the harmonic balancer bolt broken loose. So I decided to put that on pause for a few minutes and get the rest of the stuff that I know how to take off on top of the engine. So we'll come back to this once I get the upper intake off and see what's next. Okay, so I've got the upper intake off. Move that out of the way. Basically, it's just taking all those bolts out, and then you've got this hose here. You've got this one here. There was one that was on the intake that was hooked up right there. I put a bucket down below because it does leak a little bit. There's also one right here. And then you've got a couple of vacuum hoses back here that need to come off. And there's an electrical connector here. And basically once you get all that off, you have to kind of to be gentle to get it the rest of the way off. Now, this is where things in my mind get a little more complex. I'll be taking the serpentine belt loose, and these V8s are a little tricky. You want to be careful. I put a new tensioner on it last year, not quite a year ago, so I'm not going to replace the tensioner, but you have to be careful and release the tension a little bit at a time. And then I've got a little tool that you slide over to hold that tension on there, and I'll remove the belt, take the power steering pump out, which is right here, and then I can get at my bolts for the lower intake a little bit better. And I haven't decided yet, I can't remember how I did it last time, if I took the fuel rail out or if I left it with the lower part of the intake. I have to look at that again, I'm not certain. So I'll get all that off, and I can actually walk around the back side of the vehicle here, and I'm putting everything inside the vehicle that I've taken off. So there's the intake, there's my plastic trim pieces I've taken off, try to keep everything organized. I've got a tray to put all my bolts in to keep them straight, just because you don't want to have to try to remember how to put all this stuff back together. Oh, the other thing, this is the PCV valve, and there's two 10mm bolts. I just pull that whole thing rather than trying to take those off. And I replaced all these hoses last year when I did the valve cover gaskets, so I'm not going to replace those at this time. All right, so I'm back at it here. I got the crankshaft vibration dampener or harmonic balancer, whatever you want to call it, off today. Just used an impact wrench and took it right loose. And then I used just a really cheap tool set from O'Reilly's to remove the balancer. Here, let's just use that. Was able to get those bolts in there. The biggest thing that I noticed is these bolts right there. When you've put those in, first of all, you want to get them even on each side before tightening this down. But those threads down in there were pretty rusty, so I really lubed those up, and I used a different bolt to kind of work it in and out before I put these bolts in, because I want to make sure I could thread them in okay. And yeah, so did that, and it was not very difficult to get that pulled off. Just used a 3/8 inch ratchet with a 19mm and was able to get that right off. And there is a key on the vibration dampener, so it's it should be easy to get back on. There's not really a way to get it on there the wrong way, which I was happy about. So okay, so got the lower intake off, and in order to get that lower intake off, I pulled the fuel rail off first, which just has 3 bolts on the top, and then there is one of those quick connect deals back there. If you look right there, there's the fuel line, and that fuel line comes all the way around here, and then there's a fuel pressure regulator that bolts on, sorry about the light there, that bolts on right there. Unplugged that, unbolted that, and then remove those 3 top bolts and pulled the fuel rail off. There's also another little bolt that goes along kind of right up in here where the fuel line runs to the back of the back valve cover. And then pulled these bolts all out of the lower intake, and I've also got the power steering pump off. There's 3 bolts that hold that on. You can see there's 1, 2, and 3 is where those 3 bolts went. So that's off. Now I'm going to disconnect all of the coil packs, take those all off, unplug them, and do the same with the back. Unhook the back fuel line, get everything out of the way, unplug all the stuff that's holding those on, get both valve covers off, and then I will start pulling this stuff off of the front of the engine in order to get the timing cover off. One thing I found the last time when I did these, there is these bolts, or nuts I should say, right there that are ground wires for the, there's one there and one right there. They're the ground wires for the coil packs. They're both front and back. What I found is that it's very important to be careful you don't just start turning those, because they'll break the wires off. I got a real thin wrench. I believe it was a 10. I'll have to find out, 10mm. And you can get that underneath of that nut in between. So there's a nut on top of there, and then there's like a stud with another, like the bolt head. And I think it's a 10mm also. But you need a thin wrench to kind of wiggle in there, so that way that doesn't turn and just rip that wire out of there. So remember that from when I did the valve covers last year, and So get the valve covers off and then start pulling the pieces off the front of the engine, the pulleys and everything. All right, so I've got both valve covers off. I don't know why, but I had a heck of a time on those back ground wires getting those loose. I used my little wrench. I got the front ones off, but I could not get the back ones to come loose. And it's the little wrench I had started to round off the head of the bolt. So I ended up cutting these, which I did not want to do. And then I'll have to just splice those. So yeah, that was kind of frustrating to me. But there's a couple of things on top of the valve cover. I'll go over here. There's a couple of bolts you have to take off in order to get things off the way you want them. There was these two bolts that hold a two 10 millimeters that hold like some sort of a vacuum device on there. There's these two 10 millimeter bolts that help hold the wiring harness. Mine is all cracked where the plastic kind of is supposed to be bolted down with these, so I just had to take it loose, but because it's all brittle. You have to be very careful because all this stuff is brittle, so even unplugging all of the coil packs, I've just noticed on almost all Volvos, anything plastic or rubber seems to get pretty brittle. There's the fuel rail. After I had that out, I'm gonna put all this stuff inside the vehicle. I just set it here so that way it could kind of air out and the fuel vapors could escape, and then I'll put it inside of a box in the back of the XC so nothing gets damaged. It's always good. There again, I'm kind of on a budget, but it's good to, if you can afford it, put new O-rings on. I bought a couple of extras that I have around. I only damaged one of the O-rings taking it out. And so yeah, next step, now that I've got all of this stuff off, and I'm going to bring the hood down to try to keep it as clean as I can here in the garage. Now I'm going to start removing pieces off the front of the timing cover. You can see here's the top of the timing cover. Here's the fuel rail. I took those two. There was a nut there and then a bolt down further so I could pull that away. Helps get the valve covers off too. And I'm going to be pulling these pulleys off. This is new. I put this tensioner on last year, so I'm not replacing that. But I'll take the tensioner off and take those pulleys off. And I'm not certain if I need to take the alternator down there off or if I just need to take one bolt off. And I know they also are saying that it's best, here I'm going to get this light, I think we need to put a jack under the engine and then, let's see here, remove that motor mount there because the timing cover kind of comes down there and it bolts into there. So we'll be doing that. And then we'll start cleaning everything up and preparing it to start putting back together. So, all right, thanks.
I'm coming out of my little hole. What are you doing?
All right. So I've got the timing cover off. This is what it looks like behind the timing cover. I'm just going to kind of go through things really quick. Here's the timing cover. You can see where all the holes are is where there was bolts holding it on. In addition, on the bottom side, there is a bolt that comes up here and here from the oil pan. And I tried to be really just careful, bust up my knuckles a bit, but took all of those bolts loose by hand. Just didn't want to jerk anything too hard. We got all those out. Prior to that, I removed this engine pad here. There was those 3 bolts on that side, and then one here, and then 2 17 millimeters that go down. You can just see how bad this thing has been leaking. Yeah, there's a 17 there and a 17 there that held the engine pad on. So remove that. I have a jack under the engine just kind of holding that stable. So took those loose. I did end up taking, I thought I was going to have to, but I did, yes, take the pulley off for the water pump. And those were just 10 millimeters. And one of the things that I found worked really well is I had a kind of a square, see it's right here. I had this tool right here for removing like door panels on cars, and it's square. So I was able to just kind of go like so to hold it tight and then remove, loosen up 2 of the 10 millimeter bolts. And then I did it the other way and came loose, no problem. Probably could have broken those loose before I removed the serpentine belt. Didn't think about it, but they came off pretty easy. Once that was out of the way and all those pulleys I removed ahead of time too from the timing cover. Once those were all out of the way, it was kind of sealed on there because there's some glue that's used in the areas where the seals are not, and I just kind of slowly pulled on it and worked it a little bit, and then it just like popped right off. So I don't think I'm going to replace my water pump, but I'm going to keep an eye on it. You can see there's been a little bit of kind of corrosion right there on the top of the water pump, but it spins real nice and there's no play in it, so I think that's a good sign. There again, if you're not on a tight budget, it's probably good to do all this stuff now. I know alternators can cause troubles on these too. There again, mine spins nice and I'm not having any trouble, any charging issues. But if you're not worried about budget, I'd put an alternator on and a water pump at this time, just because you're in this far. But yeah, so I think that's about it. Got the cover off. I'm gonna get everything cleaned up really well. I actually I ordered part of a kit from FCP Euro, like using those guys for a lot of things. The RTV they sent me, it is like an L-Ring brand RTV. It's just plain RTV. And I remember reading somewhere that the original RTV that's used with these is a Worth brand, a German brand. It's like super RTV. So I went ahead and ordered a tube of that stuff, and it's like 40 some bucks. I think I got it for, just because I did not want to take the chances. So I'm gonna have this apart for a few days. I'm gonna cover this up as best I can so I don't have too much dust or anything getting into the engine. Close the hood down, and then just spend my time cleaning things well. So yeah, I'll get back to you when we start putting things back together. Just thought I'd shoot a little video of this. This is a piece of the seal that's in there, and that's why these things leak. This is just, I mean, you can see it's just brittle, so things are just falling apart on those rubber seals with time and heat under the engine there. All right, so it is a few days later, and I believe I've got everything cleaned up here. Might hit a couple of more spots a little bit, but really tried to get everything cleaned off of there well and wiped off with brake cleaner. And yeah, so I think it's about ready to put the timing cover back on. So this is the inside of the timing cover. I've got all the new seals setting on it. I will follow the recommended Volvo procedure for putting the sealant back on it. I got this stuff. It's recommended as being the same as the factory stuff, so I'll apply that, and it says you're supposed to have that back on there within 5 minutes. I've got all new bolts. And so I'll be putting those in, torquing them properly to 24 Newton meters. And I also did put a new crank seal in. So yeah, we'll go from there. Okay, so I got it all back on. All new bolts. As you see down in there, right in there, you can kind of see some of the RTV oozing out, which I think is a good sign. This whole thing has me nervous, trying to do everything really slow. RTV oozed out just a little bit there, so I kind of smoothed it out with my finger. Yeah, I think everything went pretty straightforward. It was a little tricky down at the bottom. There's those two bolts right there and there that come up from the oil pan. I found those just a little tricky to get back in. I ended up getting all my other bolts started. So I only had like 5 minutes to get things kind of set up there nicely. And so I got all my other bolts started. I ended up tightening them just a little bit, these bottom two, to draw it in a little bit. Otherwise, I couldn't get those two bolts that were coming up from the oil pan to start. And yeah, once I did that, got everything started, got it in a ways, and then I torqued everything to 24 Newton meters is what the factory recommendation was. And so yeah, I think everything should be good. I'm gonna start putting things back together. I think tonight I'm just gonna put that motor mount back on, clean it up a little bit down there. You can see there's still a bunch of oil. I'll clean that up some more and then put that motor mount on, and then hopefully work on it again some more tomorrow. So I think one of the keys that I would say is if you have the time to take on this, it's probably a lot easier because you can just take a break in between things and not get frustrated. So, all right. All right, so I've got both valve covers back on. I repaired the wires on the back. I'm not sure how well we can see them. Yeah, I repaired those. All right, my phone died on the last, when I was showing the valve covers. So after doing the valve covers, getting those on, I put the lower intake on. It's basically just a reverse of what we did before. So lower intake, torqued those bolts down. I believe it's 19 Newton meters is what those go to. One thing that you really want to pay attention to that I learned the first time I did this is the power steering pump has one on the bracket. You can't see it now because I already set the upper intake on, but you'll see what I mean once you get that far. There's a bracket kind of back in there on the power steering pump. There's 3 bolts here and then a bracket that sits on top of the lower part of the intake. And you got to get all of your other bolts in the lower intake and torque those prior to putting that one in. Now I always stick it in, kind of get it threaded in a little bit, and then tighten up all my other ones. I always work from inside to out and torque those all up, and then set the power steering pump on, put that last bolt in, torque that one, put all these, put the other front ones in, kind of get them all somewhat tight, and then torque everything. But that's a major pain if you don't do that. You can't get that bolt in very easily. And so yeah, everything else is just a reverse of putting it back together. Once that lower intake was in, then I put the fuel rails back on. I ended up having 2 O-rings that were torn, so replaced those, put a little bit of motor oil around the O-rings before putting it back in, and then got the fuel rail bolted back on, hooked up my fuel lines right back there, just snap those back on. I used the quick release tool to get those loose before, and yeah, I got all that done and put the upper intake on. I don't have any of the bolts tight on that yet, but just set it on. Got my hoses all hooked back up. Got the PCV valve bolted back on. I just need to torque all these bolts down on the upper intake. I will be putting the belt and everything back on after I put the harmonic balancer on, obviously, and then my motor mount was kind of bad, but they only had a factory one at FCP Euro. The aftermarket one was on back order, and so it wasn't horrible, but it wasn't great. So what I did, just as a temporary fix, is I took some 3M window weld and lifted it up and shot in there. Also did on the back side, can't see, my light's kind of in a weird spot. If you can kind of see in there, put some 3M window weld in there just to firm it up a bit. I'll replace this motor mount at some point in the next few months, but for now I just wanted to get it back together. So yeah, I'll put the motor mount back on and the harmonic balancer, and then we'll finish up with putting the serpentine belt back on and covers back on, put all of the power steering hose, power steering reservoir, and all that good stuff back together, and probably be able to have it running tomorrow. And yeah, one thing, I can't remember if I said this before, but this, I'd put this this new serpentine belt tensioner on last year, so I knew it was still in pretty good shape. I know they say you just want to be very careful when taking the tension off of those, not to go too much at a time, go real nice and slow. And then I put this retainer thing on there that it came with. I saved that because that holds the tension off, so you can put the belt off and on really easily. But yeah, I'll do the same thing when putting the belt back on, just gently release that tension. So, all right, that's it for tonight. All right, so I got all the components back on the front of the engine. The tensioner is always a little bit tricky. One of these days I need to get an actual tool. It's a 19 millimeter to remove the tension, and I put a new tensioner on it last year, so I did not replace it. Just be careful not to overdo trying to rush it, go nice and slow, release it, and it's relatively easy. Just getting the actual breaker bar in and out of there is tricky. But anyway, everything's put back on. Got coolant in it. I only use the Pentosan coolant, which is supposed to be like Volvo factory, and then power steering fluid back in, but it was a little low, so I'm gonna have to order some of that also. Also use the Pentosan, I think it's CHF 202. Yeah, so it's almost ready to start. I'm not putting the top bar on there yet because I want to make sure that I don't have any leaks. Not putting the engine covers on yet. But again, make sure there's no leaks anywhere. But yeah, it's mostly back together. Do a video once it's up and running, and should be about done. Hey, so this is Josh. We are just getting ready to take off. It's been about 3 weeks since I did the timing cover job on the XC. It's running good, no apparent leaks, and we'll be driving about 8.5 hours today. So I usually like to test it out a little bit before we take a trip, and everything seems to be working good. There's a few issues, you know, it's got 192,000 miles on it, got a slight exhaust leak, and brakes are getting a little bit worn. We'll be replacing the brakes with some Brembos off of S60R and parting out a little bit later, but yeah. And there is the engine. Cleaned it all up, Painted the intake with some aluminum paint and painted the valve cover covers as well. And so yeah, it looks pretty good for a car with 192,000 miles on it.